Confederation Base, Silver City, New Mexico. A thunderous explosion shattered the stillness of dawn. Sirens wailed, soldiers shouted, and the ground shook with the pounding of armored boots. The rapid burst of assault rifles cut through the air. "Corporal Dawson, damn it! Belay that! Pursue the enemy! Don't let those rebels get away!" Sergeant McMillan, his face flushed with fury, sprinted after the fading figure slipping into the shadows of the forest. His squad rushed after him, and Corporal Dawson, not wanting to push his luck, hurried to join them. The sun had barely started to rise, its faint rays struggling to push through the thick canopy of the Gila National Reserve. Every tree here felt cold and uninviting. The noise from the base, the shouting and sirens, was now far behind, replaced by the crunch of branches underfoot, the curt orders from the sergeant, and the distant shouts of the rebels. Spanish voices fading away. Soon, their voices faded to complete silence. McMillan slowed and signaled a halt. In the tense stillness, the troopers spread out, eyes scanning their surroundings warily. Dawson flipped up the visor of his helmet and noticed for the first time that the sergeant, in his rush, had left his helmet back at the base. A strange crunch came from beneath Dawson's boot. He looked down, a crushed pumpkin. "Damn it, we can't sweep this whole forest on foot," the sergeant muttered, frustrated. As he pulled out a cigarette, he lit it, exhaling smoke into the cool air. "Dawson, report to base. We've lost the enemy's trail. Send your coordinates and tell them to deploy the Cyclone. We'll scan the area," McMillan growled. "Sergeant!" a trooper shouted from nearby. Dawson turned to Rifleman Wilson, who had cut McMillan off. Good kid, the corporal thought. The kind of boy a mother sends off to the army with pride. Wouldn't hurt a fly, but his aim could make even a seasoned sergeant jealous. "Rifleman Wilson, report." "Sir, I see some structures between the trees, sir. Might be where the rebels are hiding." Dawson narrowed his eyes, trying to get a better look. Sure enough, through the leaves, the outlines of old abandoned buildings began to emerge. They looked strangely familiar. The design, the Confederate plating, but Dawson didn't remember anything like this on the maps. He glanced at McMillan for some insight, but the sergeant looked just as lost. "Third squad, fan out. We're moving toward the buildings. Report back to base." The troopers were met by an eerie, oppressive silence as they approached the dark, abandoned structures. In the distance, the howls of forest animals could be heard, but here, there was only an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The old outpost stood in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out any trace of sunlight. Dawson's eyes flicked over the decorations on the buildings. Witches, bats, pumpkins. He sneered quietly. Halloween was never his thing. McMillan led the team toward the warped entrance of the former command post. The power was out, but the door was cracked open, and judging by the fresh tracks, it hadn't been long. The rebels must have holed up here. One by one, the troopers switched on their helmet lights and entered the building. "Pair off! Velasquez, flamethrower, you're with me," McMillan ordered. Dawson ended up with Wilson. Something about this place set him on edge. Their lights barely pierced the thick, almost tangible darkness. Every room was littered with overturned furniture and scattered equipment, signs of a rushed evacuation, as though they had fled in panic. Dawson occasionally caught fragments of his comrades' radio chatter. Judging by the reports, their findings were much like his own. Scattered belongings, signs of a hasty retreat, but nothing to suggest the rebels were still around. His attention shifted to a stack of papers left on a nearby table. Some kind of experiment logs. They seemed encrypted. Otherwise, titles like Mask of Midnight Shadows and Mirror of the Dusk Soul made no sense. He started reading. The logs described the reactions of test subjects, probably volunteers, exposed to these strange masks and mirrors. The conclusion offered little explanation. 9 out of 10 subjects experienced an irreversible morphological transformation into a structurally altered state resembling cucurbita pepo, marked by distinct orange pigmentation and a segmented surface.
Corporal Dawson, you need to see this.
Wilson's voice broke his focus. Dawson walked over to where Wilson was shining his flashlight into a dark corner of the room. Slumped against the wall was the body of a dead rebel. His helmet had been flung aside with such force it shattered. His arms were several feet away from the body, and his ribcage had been crushed inward, bones exposed. His face was twisted into a mask of terror, with a bundle of fibers protruding from his mouth. A pool of blood was still slowly spreading beneath him. A monstrous roar, filled with rage and agony, ripped through the building, reverberating off the walls. Dawson stumbled, his heart hammering in his chest.
Sergeant, we found one of the rebel riflemen. He's dead, but there's someone else here. Sergeant?
The radio stayed silent. The air around them thickened with an unnerving stillness.
Wilson, we need to get out of here,
Dawson muttered, tension creeping into his voice.
McMillan, if you're alive, we're heading for the exit.
The only sound was Dawson's own ragged breathing as they retraced their steps, footsteps echoing down the empty corridors. He kept glancing over his shoulder, the feeling of being watched tightening its grip. Wilson was getting jumpy too. They'd been walking too long. The exit should have been here by now. The grim truth hit them. They were completely lost. Suddenly, rushed footsteps echoed from around the corner. They raised their guns, ready. In the darkness, a flicker of light appeared, like glowing eyes and a jagged grin carved into a pumpkin. The footsteps stopped. Then, a furious scream tore through the silence. Dawson recognized Velasquez's voice. A moment later, the corridor erupted in flames from a flamethrower. But just as quickly, the howl returned. The same gut-wrenching sound that made their hearts freeze. When Dawson reached the spot where the flamethrower had been, all that remained was his torn body, smashed into the concrete wall. The flamethrower lay in pieces, with blood and the fiery fuel mixture pooling on the floor.
"Head Major,"
Velasquez whispered, his voice fading as he died. Somewhere in the base, a machine gun burst echoed briefly, cut off by another deafening roar. Closer this time, flickers of orange light danced across the walls.
Corporal, over here!
Wilson's shout rang through the darkened corridors. They bolted, not daring to glance back. Behind them came sounds that turned their blood to ice, the crack of breaking bones, the dying screams of comrades, and an unearthly roar that seemed to reach into their very souls. Panic drove them forward, and before Dawson realized it, he overtook Wilson. Fear clenched his heart, turning every step into a struggle against fate. But the footsteps behind them were gaining. Their pursuer was closing in. Suddenly, there was a scream, the clatter of a rifle hitting the ground. Dawson skittled to a halt and spun around, his blood running cold. There, in the middle of the corridor, towered a hulking figure. Something that had once been a man. It still wore a Confederate major's uniform, but where its head should have been, there was a pumpkin. Its carved eyes and jagged mouth glowing with an ominous, pulsing orange light. Like some infernal flame, the glow bounced off the walls, casting everything in a nightmarish hue. The creature held Wilson by the head with one massive hand, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. Wilson thrashed helplessly, his legs kicking in the air. The pumpkin-headed monster twisted Wilson's body with a brutal snap. His neck broke, and he went limp. Dawson could only watch in horror as Wilson's lifeless body crumpled to the floor, his head rolling away like a discarded fruit. The creature slowly lowered its gaze to it. With a sickening, wet crunch, it stomped on Wilson's head, just like the pumpkin Dawson had crushed on the forest trail earlier. The monster took a few steps toward Dawson. The flames in its hollow eyes flickered brighter, feeding on Dawson's terror. locking its burning gaze on him. It spoke in a deep, guttural voice that seemed to rise from the depths of the grave.
Trick or treat.